The story opens with a detailed description of Jonathan Carter, a young man in his early 20s, who is studying political science at the prestigious Jefferson University. Jonathan is known for being polite, hardworking, and highly opinionated. One of his signature traits is his unwavering belief in freedom of speech and expression, values deeply instilled in him by his family. Unbeknownst to most, Jonathan is the son of billionaire philanthropist Robert Carter, the university's owner and benefactor. However, Jonathan keeps his identity a secret, preferring to be treated like any other student. On a brisk autumn morning, Jonathan decides to wear a MAGA hat to campus, not as a political statement, but as a symbol of his belief in open dialogue. He's met with mixed reactions. Some students glare, some avoid him, but a small group approaches him with open curiosity. The tension escalates during Professor Linda Simmons' sociology class. Known for her progressive views, Professor Simmons often challenges students to think critically, but her disdain for conservative ideologies is evident. When Jonathan enters the classroom, wearing his MAGA hat, the atmosphere grows chilly. Professor Simmons begins her lecture, but her focus repeatedly drifts to Jonathan. Her irritation builds until she finally calls him out. "Mr. Carter, do you think your hat is appropriate for an academic setting?" she asks, her tone laced with sarcasm. Jonathan replies calmly, "I believe this hat represents my right to free speech, which is very much appropriate in an academic setting." This exchange sets the stage for the conflict to come. The tension in the classroom continues to simmer as Jonathan remains firm in his stance. The MAGA hat, now the focal point of the lecture, casts a shadow over the lesson as Professor Simmons diverts her planned curriculum to discuss symbols of oppression and divisiveness. Her comments are thinly veiled criticisms of Jonathan's choice of headwear, drawing murmurs and chuckles from certain students in the room. "Symbols like that," she says, pointing directly at Jonathan, "represent an ideology that marginalizes people. In this classroom, we strive for inclusivity, and frankly, that hat contradicts the principles of respect we aim to uphold." Jonathan, ever composed, raises his hand to respond. "Professor, I respectfully disagree. Isn't the point of a university to foster debate, challenge ideas, and encourage dialogue? By targeting my hat, aren't you stifling the very freedom of expression that makes our society diverse and inclusive?" The class falls silent. Some students nod in agreement, while others glare at Jonathan with contempt. Professor Simmons, visibly flustered, doesn't take kindly to being challenged in front of her students. She declares the discussion over, but her resentment lingers. The dean gets involved later that day. Jonathan is summoned to the dean's office. Dean Richardson, a man known for his diplomatic approach, greets Jonathan with a mix of concern and exasperation. "Jonathan," he begins, "I have received complaints about your conduct in Professor Simmons' class. She feels your hat disrupted the learning environment." Jonathan raises an eyebrow. "My hat disrupted the environment? Or was it the professor who turned a lecture into a personal attack on me?" Dean Richardson sighs, clearly caught between appeasing faculty and addressing Jonathan's concerns. "Look, I'm all for free speech, but there's a fine line between exercising your rights and provoking others. Perhaps, for the sake of harmony, you could refrain from wearing that hat in class." Jonathan leans forward, his voice steady. "Dean, with all due respect, this isn't about harmony. This is about principle. If I back down now, what's next? Will I be told not to express my beliefs outside the classroom? Where does it end?" The dean, realizing Jonathan's resolve, tries to defuse the situation. "I'll speak with Professor Simmons and make sure this doesn't escalate further. But Jonathan, tread carefully. Not everyone is as understanding as I am." A turning point in the cafeteria later that afternoon, Jonathan heads to the campus cafeteria, still wearing his MAGA hat. The room grows quiet as he enters. Whispers ripple through the crowd, and a few students openly point at him, their faces filled with disdain. Jonathan picks up his lunch and sits at an empty table, seemingly unfazed by the stares. However, it doesn't take long for a group of students to confront him. Led by a senior named Emily, who's known for organizing protests and rallies, the group approaches Jonathan with hostility. "Hey, Jonathan, Emily sneers. Do you really think wearing that hat is a good idea? You're just asking for trouble. Jonathan looks up calmly. I didn't realize expressing my beliefs was considered asking for trouble. Emily crosses her arms. It's not about beliefs. That hat represents hate, and by wearing it, you're endorsing everything it stands for. Jonathan sets his fork down, his tone firm but measured. What it represents to you might be different from what it represents to me. For me, it's about the right to speak freely, even when others disagree. If we start silencing people because we don't like what they have to say, we lose the foundation of what this university and this country stands for. The confrontation attracts a crowd, and tensions rise as more students join the argument. Jonathan, outnumbered but unyielding, defends his position with logic and composure. Eventually, the cafeteria staff intervenes, dispersing the crowd before things get out of hand. As Jonathan leaves, he notices a few students nodding at him in quiet support. While he feels the weight of opposition, he's reassured that he's not entirely alone. The fallout from the cafeteria confrontation spreads quickly across campus. Social media posts flood the university's online forums, with some students calling Jonathan a provocateur and others defending his right to wear the MAGA hat. Memes, videos, and heated debates erupt, turning Jonathan into the most talked-about student at Jefferson University. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, Professor Simmons takes the controversy as a personal affront. She drafts a formal complaint, accusing him of creating a hostile learning environment and inciting division on campus. Her influence within the university is significant, and her complaints reach the administration swiftly. 2 days after the cafeteria incident, Jonathan receives a formal summons to appear before the university's disciplinary committee. The letter is vague, citing conduct unbecoming of a Jefferson University student as the reason for the hearing. The disciplinary hearing takes place in a small, stuffy conference room with a panel of faculty members seated at one end of the table. Dean Richardson sits at the center, looking visibly uncomfortable. On the opposite side of the table, Jonathan sits alone, dressed sharply in a suit and still wearing his MAGA hat, a silent yet powerful statement of his resolve. Professor Simmons is present, her expression cold and triumphant. Several other professors and student representatives, all with varying degrees of skepticism and hostility, observe the proceedings. Dean Richardson begins the hearing with a tone of forced neutrality. Jonathan Carter, you have been brought before this committee to address allegations of disruptive behavior and creating a divisive atmosphere on campus. Do you understand the charges? Jonathan nods. I understand, but I don't agree with them. Professor Simmons interjects immediately. Mr. Carter's actions have gone beyond personal expression. By wearing that hat, he has intentionally antagonized his peers and disrupted the learning environment. It's not about free speech. It's about respect and responsibility, Jonathan calmly replies. With all due respect, Professor, how is my wearing a hat any more disruptive than your decision to single me out in class? If anyone created a hostile environment, it wasn't me. The tension in the room is palpable. The panel begins questioning Jonathan about his actions, his motives, and the events in the cafeteria. Jonathan responds thoughtfully, pointing out inconsistencies in the accusations and emphasizing his right to freedom of expression. Despite his measured responses, the atmosphere is stacked against him. Several members of the panel seem to have already made up their minds, nodding in agreement with Professor Simmons' statements. After hours of back-and-forth arguments, the hearing concludes. Dean Richardson announces that the panel will deliberate and inform Jonathan of their decision within 48 hours. Jonathan leaves the room, his head held high, but with a growing sense of unease. The verdict 2 days later, Jonathan receives an email from the university. The subject line reads, "Disciplinary decision." With a deep breath, he opens the email. The verdict is swift and severe. Jonathan is being expelled from Jefferson University for behavior inconsistent with the values of the institution. The news hits Jonathan hard. He sits in his dorm room, staring at the email in disbelief. He knows this isn't just about the hat. It's about a broader issue of intolerance for differing viewpoints. His expulsion is quickly made public, sparking an even bigger controversy. News outlets pick up the story, framing it as a clash between free speech and institutional values. Jonathan becomes a polarizing figure, with some hailing him as a defender of free expression and others labeling him a troublemaker. As the media storm intensifies, Jonathan decides to call his father, Robert Carter. For years he had kept his identity as the son of Jefferson University's owner a secret, wanting to succeed on his own merits. But now, with his academic career at stake, he knows it's time to reveal the truth. As that evening, Jonathan calls his father, Robert Carter, a man who commands both respect and fear in equal measure. Robert is not only a billionaire but also a self-made man with a reputation for being ruthlessly fair and fiercely protective of his family. The call is brief and to the point. "Dad," Jonathan begins, his voice steady but tinged with frustration, "I need to talk to you about something important. I've been expelled from Jefferson University." There's a long pause on the other end of the line before Robert replies, his tone calm but firm. "Explain." Jonathan recounts the events leading up to his expulsion. The MAGA hat, the confrontation with Professor Simmons, the disciplinary hearing, and the final verdict. He leaves nothing out, knowing that his father values honesty above all else. When he finishes, Robert's response is measured. "I see. And you didn't think to mention earlier that you were having problems at school." "I wanted to handle it myself." Jonathan admits, "I didn't want anyone to know I'm your son. I wanted to earn my place." Robert chuckles softly, though there's no humor in it. "You've earned plenty, Jonathan. But sometimes, people need to be reminded who they're dealing with." "I'll take care of this." Jonathan hesitates. "Dad, I don't want you to fix this just because you can. I want you to address it because it's wrong. What they did, what the university stands for, it's a betrayal of everything you've built." Robert's tone turns serious. "Don't worry, son. This isn't about privilege. It's about principle. I won't let them get away with this." Robert Carter steps in the next morning. Robert arrives at the Jefferson University administration building, his presence commanding attention. Dressed in a tailored suit and exuding authority, he strides through the halls like a man on a mission. Dean Richardson, who had received a call from Robert's office earlier that morning, is waiting nervously in his office. When Robert enters, the dean stands up quickly, extending a hand. "Mr. Carter, it's a pleasure to see you." "I wasn't expecting." Robert cuts him off. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Dean. I'm here to discuss my son, Jonathan Carter, and the grave injustice your university has committed against him." Dean Richardson stammers, caught off guard. I wasn't aware Jonathan was your son. I assure you the decision was made by the disciplinary committee, not me personally." Robert's gaze is cold. "Don't insult my intelligence. As the dean, you're responsible for the actions of your faculty and the treatment of your students." Jonathan's expulsion wasn't just unfair. It was a violation of his rights. Dean Richardson fumbles for a response. "Mr. Carter, I assure you, the decision was based on the university's code of conduct." Jonathan's actions were deemed disruptive? Disruptive? Robert interrupts, his voice rising. "My son wore a hat." He expressed an opinion. "If that's disruptive, then your institution has failed in its duty to foster open dialogue and intellectual growth." The dean begins to sweat under Robert's intense scrutiny. I can review the decision." "You'll do more than that," Robert says firmly. "You'll reinstate Jonathan immediately. And you'll issue a public apology for the way he was treated." Dean Richardson tries to protest. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, this is a delicate situation. The faculty and students—" Robert slams his hand on the desk, cutting him off. "Let me make this clear. I built this university. My funding keeps the lights on. If you think I'll stand by while you trample on my son's rights, you're sorely mistaken." The fallout, the meeting sends shockwaves through the university. Within hours, Jonathan is officially reinstated as a student, and an email is sent to the entire campus community apologizing for the mishandling of the situation. However, Robert doesn't stop there. He demands a full investigation into the actions of Professor Simmons and the disciplinary committee. The results are damning. Emails reveal that Simmons had encouraged students to file complaints against Jonathan, and her conduct in the hearing is deemed unprofessional and biased. The university's board of trustees, under pressure from Robert, votes to suspend Professor Simmons indefinitely. The story becomes national news, with media outlets highlighting Jonathan's case as a cautionary tale of political bias and the erosion of free speech on college campuses. Jonathan, now fully aware of his father's influence, grapples with mixed emotions. He's grateful for his reinstatement but struggles with the knowledge that his father's intervention was necessary to achieve justice. News of Jonathan Carter's expulsion and subsequent reinstatement spreads like wildfire. Major networks, political commentators, and online influencers pick up the story, framing it as a prime example of the growing cultural divide in America. Headlines range from "Student expelled for MAGA hat sparks free speech debate" to "University scandal. Owner's son targeted for political views." Jonathan becomes an overnight sensation, with his face plastered across news channels and social media. Conservative commentators champion him as a symbol of resilience, while progressive voices criticize him, claiming the reinstatement was a result of nepotism. The controversy becomes a flashpoint in the ongoing national discourse about freedom of expression on college campuses. Jonathan's first interview. Jonathan reluctantly agrees to an interview with a major news network. Sitting in a brightly lit studio, he faces the host, a seasoned journalist known for their hard-hitting questions. The host begins, "Jonathan, your story has captured the attention of the nation. Can you walk us through what happened and how it felt to be expelled simply for wearing a MAGA hat?" Jonathan takes a deep breath. "It felt surreal. I never expected something as simple as wearing a hat to ignite such a firestorm. I wore it because it represents my beliefs and my support for free speech. I never intended to provoke anyone, but I also didn't expect to be targeted by my professor and ultimately, my university." The host presses further. "Critics have accused you of leveraging your father's influence to get reinstated. What do you say to that?" Jonathan's expression turns serious. "I didn't want anyone to know who my father was. Not the professors, not the students. I wanted to succeed on my own. But when the university expelled me unjustly, my father stepped in, not because of who he is, but because what they did was wrong. This isn't about privilege. It's about principle." The interview concludes with Jonathan calling for greater tolerance and open dialogue on college campuses. His calm demeanor and articulate responses win over many viewers, but the controversy continues to divide opinion. The backlash as Jonathan's story gains traction. He becomes a target of online harassment. Anonymous accounts flood his social media with hateful messages, mocking his beliefs and accusing him of being a pawn of privilege. Some go as far as to dox his personal information, forcing him to temporarily deactivate his accounts. Meanwhile, on campus, the atmosphere is tense. Some students rally in support of Jonathan, while others organize protests, demanding greater accountability from the administration. The university becomes a microcosm of the larger cultural battle playing out across the country. Jonathan tries to keep his head down, focusing on his studies and avoiding unnecessary confrontations. But the attention makes it impossible to blend in. Everywhere he goes, people whisper or stare, some offering words of encouragement while others glare with disdain. A turning point one evening as Jonathan walks to the library is approached by a group of students. At first, he braces himself for another confrontation, but to his surprise, they're there to support him. "Jonathan," one of them says, "we just wanted to say we admire your courage. You stood up for what you believe in, and that's something a lot of us are too scared to do." Another adds, "This campus needed a wake-up call. We've been so caught up in our own echo chambers that we've forgotten how to have real conversations. You reminded us of that." Their words resonate deeply with Jonathan. For the first time since the ordeal began, he feels a sense of hope. The national debate as the media frenzy continues. Jonathan is invited to speak at a free speech panel alongside prominent political figures and activists. The event draws a massive crowd, with supporters and detractors alike eager to hear what he has to say. On stage, Jonathan delivers a heartfelt speech. "This isn't about politics," he begins. "It's about the fundamental right to express ourselves without fear of retribution. College is supposed to be a place where ideas are exchanged, challenged, and debated, not where people are silenced for thinking differently. His words are met with thunderous applause from half the audience, while the other half sits in stony silence. The panel sparks a nationwide discussion, with schools, workplaces, and families grappling with the balance between free expression and mutual respect. Jonathan's return to Jefferson University is anything but quiet. The campus is alive with tension, divided into those who support him and those who view him as a symbol of everything they oppose. Students on both sides hold rallies and discussions, some peaceful and others more confrontational. Professor Simmons' suspension has caused an uproar among faculty members, with some defending her actions and others condemning her for bringing disrepute to the institution. The university administration attempts to walk a tightrope, trying to appease all sides while avoiding further negative press. Jonathan, however, is determined to focus on his education and rebuild his reputation among his peers. He keeps a low profile, attending classes and spending hours in the library, but it's clear that life on campus will never be the same. The invitation one day, Jonathan receives an unexpected invitation to join a student-led forum on campus. The forum, titled Bridging the Divide, a conversation about free speech and respect, is organized by a diverse group of students who believe that open dialogue is the only way forward. At first, Jonathan hesitates. The idea of speaking publicly on such a contentious issue feels daunting, especially given the backlash he's faced. But after some reflection, he decides to accept. The forum takes place in the university's largest auditorium, which is packed with students, faculty, and even members of the local community. Jonathan is joined on stage by a panel of speakers, including representatives from both conservative and progressive student organizations. The forum, when it's Jonathan's turn to speak, he approaches the microphone with a mixture of nerves and determination. "Thank you for inviting me to this important discussion," he begins, his voice steady but earnest. "The past few weeks have been some of the most challenging of my life, but they've also been incredibly eye-opening." He pauses, looking out at the audience. "I wore a MAGA hat because it represents my beliefs." But what happened after that wasn't just about the hat. It was about a culture on this campus, and in this country, where we're quick to label and condemn each other instead of listening and understanding. Jonathan continues, "I'm not here to change anyone's mind about politics. I'm here to advocate for something we all need. Respect. Respect for each other's right to think differently, to disagree, and to challenge ideas without resorting to personal attacks or institutional punishment." The audience is silent, hanging on his every word. "This isn't just about me," he says. "It's about all of us. We can't grow as individuals or as a society if we're too afraid to speak up. But freedom of speech comes with responsibility. The responsibility to use our words to build bridges, not burn them." When he finishes, the auditorium erupts in applause. Even some of his critics stand to clap, moved by his sincerity and the universality of his message. Campus Shifts, the forum, proves to be a turning point for the university. Inspired by Jonathan's words, more students begin engaging in open discussions about controversial topics. Clubs that once operated in isolation start collaborating on events, and the campus gradually becomes a more inclusive environment for diverse perspectives. Jonathan's newfound role as a symbol of free speech doesn't come without challenges. He continues to face criticism, especially online, but he learns to focus on the positive impact he's making. One evening, he receives an email from a freshman student who had attended the forum. "Hi, Jonathan. I just wanted to say thank you for speaking at the forum. I've always been afraid to share my opinions because I didn't want to be judged or ostracized. But hearing you speak gave me the courage to be myself. You've made a real difference, and I'm so grateful." The message brings a smile to Jonathan's face. For the first time since the ordeal began, he feels at peace, rebuilding trust. Despite the progress on campus, Jonathan knows he still has a long way to go in repairing relationships with his peers. He makes an effort to engage with students from all walks of life, attending events, joining discussions, and even collaborating on projects with people who initially opposed him. One of his most significant breakthroughs comes when he sits down for coffee with a student activist who had been one of his harshest critics. "I have to admit," the activist says, "I judged you without really knowing you. I thought you were just some privileged kid who didn't care about anyone else's struggles. But after hearing you speak, I realized I was wrong." Jonathan smiles. "I get it. I probably would have thought the same thing if I were in your shoes, but I'm glad we're talking now." Their conversation lasts for hours, covering everything from politics to personal experiences. By the end, they part ways with mutual respect, if not complete agreement. The broader impact as the weeks turn into months. Jonathan's story continues to resonate beyond the campus. He's invited to speak at other universities and conferences, sharing his experiences and advocating for a more open and respectful culture of dialogue. His father, Robert, watches proudly as Jonathan comes into his own, not as the son of a billionaire, but as a young man with a voice and a purpose. Months after the ordeal at Jefferson University, Jonathan's life has transformed in ways he never imagined. What began as a simple act of self-expression, wearing a MAGA hat, has turned him into a reluctant public figure. Though he didn't seek the spotlight, Jonathan embraces the opportunity to spark meaningful conversations about free speech, tolerance, and mutual respect. Jonathan's growing platform, Jonathan's speeches and interviews, draw large audiences, both on campus and at national events. He becomes a sought-after voice for bridging divides, appearing on podcasts, news panels, and even writing op-eds for major publications. Each time his message is consistent. We don't have to agree, but we must respect the right to disagree. He gains a significant following on social media, but he's careful not to let the attention inflate his ego. Jonathan uses his platform to highlight other stories of individuals who face challenges for expressing their beliefs, amplifying voices that might otherwise go unheard. One evening, while scrolling through his messages, he comes across a note from a student at another university. "Hi, Jonathan. I saw your story and wanted to share mine. I'm part of a group on my campus that often gets shut down because our views aren't popular. Hearing you speak gave me hope that things can change. Thank you for being brave enough to stand up." Jonathan replies immediately, offering words of encouragement and reminding the student to stay strong. These moments fuel his determination to keep pushing forward. The turning point back at Jefferson University, Jonathan's efforts to foster dialogue begin to yield tangible results. The administration introduces new policies designed to protect free speech and ensure that all students feel safe expressing their views. These include mandatory workshops for faculty on handling sensitive topics and creating open forums where students can debate contentious issues without fear of retribution. Professor Simmons, who had been suspended following the incident, publicly apologizes during a university-wide assembly. Standing at the podium, she addresses the crowd with visible remorse. "I let my personal biases interfere with my professional responsibilities," she admits. "What happened to Jonathan was unfair, and I take full responsibility for my actions. Moving forward, I'm committed to being part of the solution rather than the problem." Though some students remain skeptical of her sincerity, Jonathan surprises everyone by publicly accepting her apology. "Forgiveness is the first step toward healing," he says during the assembly. "We can't move forward as a community if we're stuck in the past. Let's use this moment as an opportunity to grow." His words earn him a standing ovation, even from those who initially opposed him. A deeper bond with his father amid all the chaos, Jonathan's relationship with his father, Robert, becomes stronger than ever. One weekend, Robert invites Jonathan to join him on a fishing trip, a tradition they'd abandoned years ago due to their busy schedules. Sitting by the water, Robert breaks the silence. "You've handled this whole situation better than I ever could have imagined, son. I'm proud of you." Jonathan smiles, casting his line into the water. "I think I've learned a lot from you, Dad. Watching how you built everything from the ground up, how you never let anyone tell you what you could or couldn't do. It's been inspiring." Robert chuckles. "Well, I think you've surpassed me in that department. You stood up for what you believed in, even when it cost you everything. That takes real courage." They spend the rest of the day reminiscing about old times, sharing laughs and stories. For Jonathan, the trip is more than just a break from the chaos. It's a reminder of the values his father instilled in him and the strength of their bond. The long-term impact. By the end of the semester, Jefferson University feels like a different place. The atmosphere of hostility that once permeated the campus has been replaced with a renewed sense of unity. Students from different backgrounds and ideologies are engaging in conversations, challenging each other's ideas without resorting to personal attacks. Jonathan's peers begin to see him not just as the owner's son or the MAGA hat guy, but as a leader who helped spark change. Professors who once avoided controversial topics now approach them with sensitivity and openness, encouraging students to think critically and respectfully. An unexpected honor at the end of the academic year, the university holds its annual awards ceremony. Jonathan is surprised to learn he's being honored with the Student Leadership Award, a recognition typically reserved for those who've made significant contributions to campus life. As he steps onto the stage to accept the award, he takes a moment to reflect on how far he has come. Looking out at the crowd, he delivers a heartfelt speech. "This award isn't just for me," he says. "It's for everyone who stood by me, even when it wasn't easy. It's for the students who dared to have tough conversations, the professors who encouraged open dialogue, and the administration for listening and learning. Together, we've shown that change is possible." The audience erupts in applause, a testament to the impact Jonathan has made. After completing his degree at Jefferson University, Jonathan's story continues to ripple far beyond the confines of his alma mater. His journey, once defined by a controversial hat and a professor's biased actions, has evolved into something much larger, a movement advocating for open dialogue, mutual respect, and the protection of free expression. A growing national presence following his graduation, Jonathan is approached by multiple organizations and think tanks interested in his perspective on free speech and campus culture. He begins speaking at events across the country, addressing packed auditoriums at universities, civic centers, and even high-profile conferences. One of his most notable invitations comes from a major national television network, which asks him to participate in a panel discussion about the state of free speech in America. Sitting alongside prominent academics, activists, and public figures, Jonathan holds his own, delivering thoughtful insights grounded in his personal experience. "Free speech isn't just about protecting the voices we agree with," he says during the broadcast. "It's about protecting the voices we don't agree with. Because when we start silencing people based on ideology, we lose the diversity of thought that drives progress." His words resonate with millions of viewers, many of whom write letters and emails thanking him for his courage and clarity. Founding the Open Voices Initiative, inspired by his growing platform, Jonathan decides to take his advocacy a step further. With financial backing from his father and other supporters, he establishes the Open Voices Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting civil discourse and protecting free speech on college campuses. The organization's mission is simple yet ambitious: to create environments where students can discuss even the most controversial topics without fear of retaliation or censorship. Jonathan assembles a diverse team of educators, legal experts, and student leaders to help execute his vision. Together, they develop workshops, training programs, and resources designed to foster open dialogue and equip students with the tools to navigate complex discussions. The initiative quickly gains traction, partnering with universities across the country to implement its programs. Jonathan becomes a frequent presence on campuses, where he meets with students and faculty to hear their concerns and offer guidance. Resistance and persistence. Of course, not everyone is on board with Jonathan's mission. Critics accuse him of promoting harmful ideologies or giving a platform to hate speech. Protesters occasionally disrupt his events, holding signs and chanting slogans that denounce his efforts. But Jonathan remains undeterred. He understands that resistance is inevitable when addressing such a polarizing issue. Rather than reacting defensively, he seeks to engage his critics in conversation, often inviting them to share their perspectives during Q&A sessions. One particularly heated exchange occurs during a university event where a student activist accuses Jonathan of enabling discrimination. "I hear your concerns," Jonathan responds calmly, "and I agree. that we have a responsibility to ensure that free speech doesn't cross the line into harassment or harm. But I also believe that the best way to challenge harmful ideas is to bring them into the open and confront them with better arguments. Silencing them doesn't make them go away. It just pushes them underground. The room falls silent as the activist considers his response. While they don't reach a consensus, their exchange sets the tone for a productive discussion among the audience. A global stage. As the Open Voices initiative expands, Jonathan is invited to speak at international forums, including the United Nations and global summits focused on human rights and education. His message about the importance of free expression resonates across cultural and political boundaries, earning him recognition as a global advocate for civil liberties. During one such event in Geneva, Jonathan delivers a keynote address that captures the attention of world leaders and activists alike. In every corner of the world, the freedom to speak, think, and express ourselves is under threat, he says, but it's not just about protecting individual voices. It's about protecting the very fabric of democracy. Without free speech, we lose the ability to challenge injustice, question authority, and push for change. His speech receives a standing ovation, solidifying his reputation as a thoughtful and principled leader. Reflection and gratitude. Despite his busy schedule, Jonathan makes it a point to return to Jefferson University at least once a year. During these visits, he meets with current students, participates in forums, and mentors young leaders who are passionate about creating positive change. On one such visit, he's approached by a freshman who nervously introduces herself. "I just wanted to say thank you," she says. "Your story inspired me to come to Jefferson. I want to make a difference, just like you did." Jonathan smiles, humbled by her words. "You already are," he replies. As he walks through the campus that once felt so hostile, Jonathan reflects on how far he's come. The challenges he faced, the lessons he learned, and the connections he made have all shaped him into the person he is today. He also thinks about his father, whose unwavering support made everything possible. Though Robert's role in the university incident remained largely behind the scenes, Jonathan knows he couldn't have navigated the ordeal without his guidance and encouragement. Looking ahead as the Open Voices initiative continues to grow, Jonathan sets his sights on even bigger goals. He envisions a world where every individual, regardless of their background or beliefs, feels empowered to speak their truth and engage in meaningful dialogue. He knows the road ahead won't be easy, but he's ready for the challenge. After all, his journey has taught him that even the smallest act of courage can spark a movement. Years have passed since Jonathan first stepped onto the stage of public discourse. His advocacy has shaped policies, changed lives, and opened minds, yet it has also demanded sacrifices. As his work reaches new heights, Jonathan begins to seek balance, a way to ground himself amidst the constant whirlwind of activism and public life. Reconnecting with the simple things. For all the accolades and achievements, Jonathan finds his greatest joy in the quiet moments. He moves back to his hometown, choosing a modest house near the lake where he and his father used to fish. The serene surroundings offer him a sense of peace that even the grandest stages can't replicate. Most mornings, Jonathan can be found sitting on the dock with a cup of coffee, reflecting on his journey. The stillness of the water and the calls of distant birds provide a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of his public life. It's during these moments that he feels most connected to his purpose. He also makes it a point to reconnect with old friends, those who knew him before he became Jonathan, the advocate. These friendships keep him grounded, reminding him of who he is beyond the speeches, interviews, and headlines. Building a personal life. As his work stabilizes, Jonathan begins to think about his personal life, something he had put on hold for years. At a university symposium, he meets a young journalist named Emily. She's sharp, passionate, and unafraid to challenge his ideas, qualities that intrigue him. Their conversations start professionally, but quickly evolve into something deeper. Over time, Emily becomes his confidant, offering perspective and support as he navigates the complexities of his work. One evening, as they walk along the lake near his home, Emily asks him, "Do you ever feel like you've done enough? Like maybe it's okay to just be?" Jonathan pauses, considering her question. "Sometimes," he admits. "But then, I think about all of the people who still feel like they can't speak up. If I stop now, who's going to fight for them?" Emily smiles, squeezing his hand. "I think you've already shown them how to fight for themselves." Their relationship blossoms, and Jonathan begins to understand the importance of balancing his passion for advocacy with his need for personal fulfillment. Expanding the mission, the Open Voices initiative continues to thrive, but Jonathan recognizes that its work is far from over. He and his team launch a new program called Bridging the Divide, which pairs students from opposing ideological backgrounds for collaborative projects. The initiative aims to foster empathy and understanding by encouraging participants to see the world through someone else's eyes. The program quickly becomes one of the initiative's most successful ventures, with universities around the globe adopting its framework. Testimonials pour in from students who credit the experience with transforming their perspectives. One participant writes, "I used to think that people who didn't share my beliefs were ignorant or malicious, but working with someone so different from me showed me that we're more alike than I ever realized. We may not agree on everything, but we found common ground. And that's a start." Honoring his father's legacy as Jonathan's influence grows, he never forgets the role his father played in shaping his path. When Robert decides to retire, he asks Jonathan to take over as CEO of their family business. Though hesitant at first, Jonathan accepts the role, seeing it as an opportunity to honor his father's legacy while integrating his own values into the company's operations. Under his leadership, the business flourishes, expanding into new markets and launching initiatives that reflect Jonathan's commitment to social responsibility. One of his first acts as CEO is to establish a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in advocacy, journalism, and public policy. The fund prioritizes applicants from underrepresented backgrounds, ensuring that the next generation of leaders has the resources they need to succeed. The ripple effect: Jonathan's efforts inspire countless others to take action in their own communities. From high school students starting free speech clubs to corporations adopting policies that encourage open dialogue, the ripple effect of his work is undeniable. At an awards gala, where Jonathan is being honored for his contributions, a former Jefferson University student approaches him. "You probably don't remember me," she says, "but I was in that lecture hall the day you got kicked out. Back then, I thought you were wrong about everything. But watching how you handled yourself, how you stood up for what you believed in without tearing others down, it changed the way I see the world. Thank you." Jonathan smiles, humbled once again by the impact of his actions. "It wasn't just me," he replies. "It was all of us. Every person who decided to have a conversation instead of an argument, to listen instead of judge. That's what made the difference." A new chapter as Jonathan approaches the next phase of his life. He feels a sense of fulfillment he never thought possible. His journey, from a college student unfairly targeted for wearing a MAGA hat to a global advocate for free speech and understanding, has been anything but easy. Yet every challenge, every setback, and every moment of doubt has led him to this point. Standing on the dock by the lake, with Emily by his side and the sun setting on the horizon, Jonathan reflects on the words his father once told him. "You have the power to change the world, son. All it takes is courage and conviction." He smiles, knowing that while his work is far from over, he's already made a difference. And that's more than enough. The years of hard work, advocacy, and dedication have brought Jonathan to the height of his career. However, as time passes, he faces an unexpected test that challenges everything he believes in: the need to confront the dark side of his own influence. The controversy erupts. It begins with a phone call late at night. Jonathan is in his home, going through the last bits of paperwork before his eyes grow too tired. The voice on the other end is urgent. "Jonathan, we need you to comment on this." It's his press secretary, Allison. She continues, "A controversial video has surfaced, showing one of the participants from your Bridging the Divide program being harassed by a group of students from the opposite side of the ideological spectrum. There's backlash. People are calling for your initiative to be shut down." Jonathan takes a deep breath. He's no stranger to controversy, but this feels different. For years, he has promoted the idea that open dialogue is the key to bridging divides. But now, it seems as though the very platform he created to promote understanding might have inadvertently fueled more division. The video, which quickly goes viral, shows a young woman, a participant from one of the less liberal universities, being verbally attacked by a group of students. The video is framed in such a way that it appears the woman's personal beliefs were mocked and belittled in the name of free speech. The incident sparks outrage on both sides of the political spectrum. A moment of doubt as Jonathan watches the video. A deep sense of guilt gnaws at him. Did his initiative, meant to foster understanding, actually create more hostility? Was he too naive in believing that everyone would approach the program with good intentions? For the first time in his career, he questions his own judgment. The weight of his choices presses heavily on him as the anger from both sides floods in. On social media, both supporters and detractors claim that Jonathan's vision has failed. In private moments, he confides in Emily. "I never imagined it would come to this," he admits. "I thought we were doing the right thing, but now I don't know." Emily, ever the voice of reason, looks at him and says, "You didn't create this problem, Jonathan. The problem was already there. What you did was give people a chance to confront it head on. Just because there's backlash doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means we've got more work to do." Jonathan takes her words to heart, but the pressure mounts. Media outlets are calling for him to denounce the program, and some of his closest allies begin to distance themselves. His supporters waver, unsure of where to stand. The self-reflection, Jonathan isolates himself for several days, pulling back from his usual public appearances and press engagements. In this time, he reconsiders everything: the Open Voices initiative, bridging the divide, and the idea that open dialogue could solve every issue. He revisits the original vision of his advocacy, creating spaces where people could connect, even when they disagreed. But now, he has to face a bitter truth. Not everyone is ready for that kind of interaction. Some are simply unwilling to hear the other side. He recalls his father's words once again. "The world is messy, Jonathan. People won't always play fair, and they'll sometimes twist your intentions to suit their own. But that doesn't mean you stop trying." With newfound clarity, Jonathan knows what he must do. He can't abandon the initiative, but he can evolve it. He realizes that fostering understanding is only part of the equation. The other part is setting boundaries and ensuring that the platform doesn't become a tool for harm. A new approach. Jonathan announces a revised version of the Bridging the Divide program. In the new iteration, participants are required to engage in structured dialogue with trained facilitators who can help guide difficult conversations and address any harmful behavior. He also institutes a zero-tolerance policy for any form of harassment, regardless of the side it comes from. It's a bold move, and some of his original supporters question his decision. They argue that it undermines the program's core principle of open dialogue. But Jonathan stands firm. "This is about respect," he says in a public statement. "It's about creating a space where people can disagree without resorting to violence, whether that's physical or verbal. We've seen what happens when we allow disrespect to flourish. We cannot and will not tolerate it anymore." A turning point. The response to the changes is mixed. Some people criticize him for compromising the program's original spirit, while others praise his willingness to evolve and take responsibility. But, slowly, as the program continues with the new guidelines in place, Jonathan begins to see results. The students involved in the most recent incident return to the table, and they engage in deeper, more constructive conversations. Despite the challenges, Jonathan begins to feel a sense of renewal. His willingness to adapt and learn from his mistakes has restored his faith in the mission. The Bridging the Divide program, once on the brink of collapse, becomes a model for other organizations looking to handle difficult conversations in a respectful and productive way. But Jonathan knows the work is far from finished. There will always be critics, always be setbacks, and always be challenges. However, he now understands that the true test of leadership is not whether one can avoid mistakes, but how one handles them when they arise. The legacy, as Jonathan reflects on the path he's walked, he feels a sense of gratitude for the lessons as learned along the way. He's no longer the idealistic young man who was kicked out of a lecture hall for wearing a MAGA hat. He's a man who has endured hardship, faced criticism, and emerged stronger for it. He looks back on his career, on the battles he's fought, the friends he's made, and the lives he's touched. While he'll never claim to have all the answers, he knows this. The pursuit of truth, the fight for understanding, and the courage to stand up for what's right are worth every sacrifice. At his home, by the lake where it all began, Jonathan receives a message from a former student of his Bridging the Divide program. It's a simple message, but it speaks volumes. "Thank you for showing us how to listen." With that, Jonathan smiles. He's come full circle. He's not just a man who fought for his beliefs. He's a man who taught others how to find their own. And that, he knows, is the legacy that matters most. Jonathan's rise in prominence had always been a source of pride, but now it felt heavier than ever. The mission he had started years ago, to promote understanding, to bridge divides, and to build connections between ideologically divided individuals, was becoming more than just a vision. It was a responsibility that weighed on him daily. Now, facing both external and internal challenges, Jonathan had to confront a painful reality. The weight of success was more than just a personal burden. It was the burden of the nation. The press conference months after he revised the Bridging the Divide program, Jonathan agreed to a press conference. It was the kind of event that many would have seen as a mere formality, but to Jonathan, it was a significant moment. He had to present himself not just as a leader, but as someone capable of owning up to mistakes and continuing the fight for a better, more united future. The room was packed with reporters, camera flashes blinding, and microphones thrust in his direction. This wasn't just any conference. This was the moment where Jonathan would address the media about the future of Bridging the Divide and whether it was truly viable. "All right, Mr. Heller," the lead reporter began. "Let's get right to it. There's been a lot of talk about the failure of your initiative to prevent incidents like the one at the university. People are saying your platform encourages division, rather than dialogue. How do you respond to that?" Jonathan looked up, his expression calm but resolute. His response wasn't one that he had scripted. It was from the heart. "I understand the criticism. I've heard it, and honestly, some of it stings. But it's important to realize something. Dialogue is never easy. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It exposes the flaws in our arguments, the cracks in our understanding of one another. I built this platform because I believe that if we can just sit down, face to face, and talk honestly, we could change this country. But that doesn't mean I'm blind to the flaws in that approach." He paused, scanning the room, making eye contact with the reporters who sat in front of him. "But if we are going to change this country, we can't shy away from tough conversations. And yes, sometimes we'll fail. But failure doesn't mean we stop. It means we try again. We refine. We adapt." Jonathan's words were met with silence as the press and the public waited for him to elaborate. "The problem isn't with the platform itself. The problem is with how we're using it." Jonathan continued, "We need to establish ground rules. Respect has to come first. If people can't have a civil conversation, we need to make it clear that those kinds of actions will not be tolerated. This isn't just about free speech. It's about responsible speech. It's about responsible speech. I'm learning that now, and I hope others will learn too." The long road ahead, the press conference marked a turning point. Jonathan's words resonated with many people, especially those who felt the backlash against the program had been unfair. The program slowly began to regain traction. Supporters rallied around the new framework for the initiative, recognizing that Jonathan had faced his critics head-on and had addressed their concerns without compromising his core principle. But not everyone was convinced. On the other side, critics continued to hammer at Jonathan, claiming that his initiative was still not enough to bridge the divide. Some people felt that any attempt at fostering unity would only make the divisions worse. They argued that the deeper issue was one of systemic division, one that couldn't be solved by a dialogue alone. Jonathan knew that no matter what, the road ahead would be tough. The work of changing a culture of division wasn't something that could be done overnight. The best he could do was push forward one step at a time. For weeks, Jonathan focused on speaking to individuals directly, both those who supported him and those who didn't. His efforts weren't just about promoting his agenda, but about truly listening. With every conversation, every forum, every interview, Jonathan found himself gaining new perspectives. And with each new perspective came a greater understanding of how difficult and deep-seated the problem of division really was. The unexpected visitor one afternoon, months after the press conference, Jonathan was in his office, working through the piles of paperwork that always seemed to accumulate, no matter how much he accomplished. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. An incoming text from an unknown number. "Jonathan, I hope you're doing well. It's been a long time. Can we talk?" It was a simple message, but Jonathan recognized the number immediately. It was from someone he hadn't spoken to in years. His former college professor, Dr. Lewis Carver. The same professor who had dismissed his early political views when he was a young, ambitious student. Dr. Carver had been the one to challenge Jonathan's thinking, to question his naivety, and to force him to see the world from a more critical angle. "Of course," Jonathan replied. "Come by my office. Come by my office." An hour later, Dr. Carver walked into Jonathan's office. The years had softened the man's edges. His hair was more salt than pepper, and his once sharp, confrontational demeanor had mellowed. They exchanged pleasantries, but Jonathan could tell something was different about this meeting. "You've been following your work, Jonathan," Dr. Carver began. Dr. Carver began, "I've been watching how you've dealt with the backlash, how you've struggled, and I've got to say, I respect how you've handled it." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Thank you, but I still have doubts. It's been a difficult road. It's been a difficult road." Dr. Carver nodded, a knowing smile crossing his face. "I know it's been tough. The path you're on isn't one of comfort. It never is. But I think you're doing something important, something real. It's rare to see people, especially young people, willing to tackle division in this country. But you've stuck to it even when it hasn't been easy." Jonathan swallowed hard. "I've been thinking a lot about what you taught me, about the fact that not everyone wants to change. Some people just want to be right. And that's something I've struggled with, especially recently." Dr. Carver leaned in, his tone shifting slightly. Dr. Carver leaned in, his tone shifting slightly. "You're right about one thing. People don't always want to change. But that's why it's crucial that we keep pushing, even when it feels like we're hitting a wall. Don't lose sight of why you started this." Jonathan took a deep breath. "Chow, you taught me that. I remember everything you said in that seminar, and it's guided me through a lot of these tough moments. But I'm starting to realize that the work ahead is never going to be easy. There will always be resistance. There will always be people who don't want to listen." Dr. Carver smiled again. "That's the challenge, but you're more prepared for it than you think. You just need to remember that true progress isn't about convincing everyone. It's about continuing to move forward, even when it feels like no one is listening." Jonathan's mind was racing as Dr. Carver left his office. For the first time in a while, he felt like he had regained some of his original clarity. There would always be resistance, but the fight for understanding had to continue. The message he had always carried, no matter the setbacks, was more important than ever. Jonathan's mission was evolving. What had started as a simple initiative to foster understanding was transforming into something larger than he could have ever anticipated. It wasn't just about dialogue anymore. It was about building a lasting coalition of like-minded individuals who would help drive the changes he wanted to see. But that path wasn't going to be easy, and Jonathan knew it. The country was divided in ways that felt insurmountable, and the division was growing stronger by the day. Still, Jonathan remained committed to the cause. The lessons from Dr. Carver had reinforced his resolve. True progress would not come from appeasing every critic. It would come from pushing forward, from engaging those willing to join the conversation, and from creating alliances that would weather the storm of adversity. A meeting of minds. Months had passed since Jonathan had revamped Bridging the Divide. He had made significant strides, securing partnerships with various advocacy groups and community leaders who shared his vision for a more united America. However, Jonathan knew that, in order to achieve long-term success, he would need to expand his influence beyond just those who already agreed with him. He needed to reach those on the fringes, the ones who were skeptical or outright hostile to his message. One evening, Jonathan received an unexpected call. It was from Michael Wallace, a conservative political strategist who had once been one of his fiercest critics. Wallace had been vocal about his opposition to Jonathan's platform, arguing that it was too idealistic and impractical. Jonathan had always found Michael's arguments frustrating, but he respected his intellect. Now, out of the blue, Michael was reaching out to him. "Jonathan, we need to talk," Wallace said, his voice serious. "I've been following your work, and I think you might be onto something. But there's a catch. I'm not in this alone. I have some colleagues who might be willing to come to the table, but they won't do it unless we're very clear about where we stand. Are you interested?" Jonathan paused. This was unexpected, to say the least. A conservative strategist coming to him with an offer. He couldn't help but be intrigued, though he remained cautious. "I'm listening," Jonathan replied. "We want to explore the idea of a coalition, an alliance of people from all sides of the political spectrum, working together to find common ground. It's going to be difficult, and it's not going to be easy, but if we're going to make real progress, we can't keep playing by the same old rules. We need to build something new." The idea of an alliance between conservatives and progressives was both exciting and daunting. Jonathan had always believed in the power of cross-ideological dialogue, but this was something different. It was a bold step, one that could either fail spectacularly or succeed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The negotiation in the weeks that followed, Jonathan and Michael worked behind the scenes, meeting with representatives from different political factions. The meetings were tense, filled with sharp disagreements, but also moments of unexpected unity. Each participant came with their own agenda, but there was one thing they all agreed on. Something had to change. One of the most powerful moments came during a meeting with Evelyn Lawson, a progressive activist who had been an outspoken critic of Jonathan's early approach. She had dismissed his ideas as naive, but over time, she had come to see the value in his commitment to dialogue. Now, sitting at the same table as conservatives like Michael Wallace, Evelyn was both wary and hopeful. "I'll be honest with you, Jonathan," Evelyn said one evening, her tone more measured than it had been in the past. "I didn't think this was possible, but after hearing from Michael and others, I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, we can make this work. We all have our differences, but we all want the same thing at the end of the day. Unity." Jonathan nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. The alliance was fragile, but it was there. And that was a start. Michael spoke up, his voice firm. "We're not here to sugarcoat things. We have serious differences. But if we're going to make this country better, we have to be willing to put those differences aside for the greater good. We have to stop thinking in terms of us versus them. That's what's been tearing us apart." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "I agree, but it's not going to be easy. We've spent decades building these divides. You can't just expect people to forget their grievances." Jonathan leaned forward, his voice steady. "I'm not asking anyone to forget, but if we can start with small steps, dialogue, understanding, and respect, maybe we can begin to rebuild what we've lost." The room fell silent as everyone considered his words. It was clear that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but there was a sense of possibility in the air. For the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope. The press release, with the formation of the coalition, Jonathan knew that the next step was to go public. He couldn't afford to keep this behind closed doors any longer. It was time to show the country that change was possible, that people from all sides of the political spectrum could work together toward a common goal. The press release went live the next morning, announcing the formation of the new coalition, the Unity Project. The release emphasized that the coalition was made up of conservatives, progressives, and moderates, all committed to fostering civil discourse and working toward solutions to the nation's most pressing issues. The reaction was immediate. The media buzzed with stories about the unprecedented alliance, and the public's response was a mixture of skepticism and optimism. Some were eager to see how this would play out, while others were dismissive, convinced that the coalition was nothing more than a political stunt. Jonathan knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The coalition would face intense opposition, both from those who were part of the entrenched political establishment and from the general public, who had grown weary of empty promises. But Jonathan was prepared to fight for what he believed in. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. The release of the Unity Project press statement marked the beginning of what Jonathan knew would be a challenging phase. While the coalition was being celebrated by some, it was also being fiercely criticized by others. The harsh words that had once been thrown at Jonathan were now being directed at the coalition as a whole, and the media landscape was as polarized as ever. However, Jonathan understood that the success of this initiative hinged on more than just media reactions. It depended on the willingness of those involved to hold steady in the face of opposition. And opposition came fast. The media frenzy within hours of the press release, the media storm, was in full swing. On one side, conservative pundits decried the coalition as a liberal takeover that would force ideological conformity, while progressive outlets accused it of watering down important social issues in the name of unity. The attacks were swift and venomous, but they were also revealing. The attacks weren't just about the concept of unity. They were about fear. Fear of change, fear of losing political ground, and fear of being misunderstood. Jonathan had expected this. In fact, he had anticipated it. His phone rang incessantly, with reporters seeking his comment. One particularly aggressive interview stood out. A reporter from a right-wing news outlet known for her inflammatory rhetoric grilled him about the coalition's motivations. "So let me get this straight, Jonathan," the reporter said, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You're telling us that a group that includes people who have actively fought against the very ideas you've championed is somehow going to work together? This is just a PR stunt, isn't it? You're not going to change anything." "It's all smoke and mirrors." Jonathan paused before responding. He could feel his pulse quicken. The temptation to snap back was strong, but he knew that this was a pivotal moment. A single misstep could shatter the fragile credibility the coalition had started to build. "No, it's not a stunt," Jonathan said calmly. "It's an opportunity for us to break through the noise and have real conversations. Conversations that we've been avoiding for too long. It's not about compromising our beliefs. It's about finding common ground to move forward together." The reporter didn't let up, but Jonathan had said his piece. As the interview ended, he felt a strange sense of calm. He knew that the real battle wasn't against the media or the critics. It was against the ideological walls that had been erected over decades, the internal struggles behind the scenes. The real challenge was unfolding within the coalition itself. What Jonathan had hoped would be a collaborative effort was becoming strained. The disparate factions, though united in their desire for unity, were finding it difficult to agree on certain issues. For every step forward, it felt like they took 2 steps back. One of the most contentious debates centered around how to address issues of social justice. Many in the progressive faction felt that the coalition wasn't doing enough to address systemic inequality, while some conservatives feared that focusing too much on social justice would alienate their base. Evelyn Lawson, who had once been so eager to join the coalition, now found herself at odds with the more conservative members of the group. "This is a non-starter," Evelyn said during one of the coalition meetings. "We can't keep ignoring the issues that disproportionately affect marginalized communities. We need to talk about wealth inequality, race, and criminal justice reform. These are foundational issues that can't be sidelined." Michael Wallace, who had been one of Jonathan's biggest supporters in the coalition, responded firmly. "Evelyn, I understand where you're coming from, but we can't push forward with an agenda that feels like it's alienating half of the country. There's a way to address these issues without alienating people who are already skeptical." Jonathan, caught in the middle of the debate, realized that the challenges the coalition was facing were much deeper than he had anticipated. The ideological divide was still very much alive, and the coalition members had different priorities that couldn't easily be reconciled. "This is what we're up against," Jonathan said, addressing the group. "We have to find a way to discuss these issues in a way that allows us to move forward together. If we're going to be successful, we can't let our differences tear us apart." But the more Jonathan tried to mediate between the factions, the more it became apparent that unity was not going to come easily. The ideological divides were deep, and every attempt to find common ground felt like an uphill battle. The public reaction as the public got wind of the internal struggles, they became more and more disillusioned with the idea of the Unity Project. A growing chorus of voices on social media expressed their disappointment, accusing the coalition of being ineffectual, hypocritical, and more concerned with optics than with meaningful change. Some even went so far as to call it weak and pointless. Jonathan's social media feeds were flooded with criticisms. On one hand, there were the conservative critics, who insisted that the coalition was nothing more than a left-wing trap designed to stifle free speech. On the other, progressive voices were angry that the coalition wasn't more outspoken in its support for social justice causes. It felt like no matter how hard he tried, Jonathan couldn't satisfy either side. Despite the overwhelming negativity, there were moments of hope. A small but growing number of individuals from all sides of the political spectrum began to rally behind the Unity Project, sharing their stories of personal growth and dialogue. These were the people who had been inspired by Jonathan's vision, and they became the foundation of the movement. One such individual was James, a former conservative radio host who had publicly supported the idea of unity after his own difficult conversations with people from different backgrounds. "I'm not saying everything is perfect," James wrote in a viral post, "but I've learned more in the last 6 months talking to people I disagreed with than I have in my entire life. The Unity Project isn't perfect, but it's the start of something that could actually work. If we all give it a chance, we might just be able to make this country better." James's post went viral, and for the first time in weeks, Jonathan felt a spark of hope. This was what he had been fighting for. The chance to build something that transcended the divisions and built upon the common humanity shared by all Americans. But Jonathan knew that the fight was far from over. The pushback was fierce, and the opposition would only grow stronger. If the Unity Project was going to succeed, it would need to do more than just survive. It would need to thrive. And to do that, Jonathan would have to navigate the storm ahead with a level of resilience he had yet to tap into. Weeks passed, and the pressure on Jonathan only intensified. The public backlash against the Unity Project was relentless, and the internal conflicts within the coalition grew sharper. Every day, there was a new challenge, whether it was media accusations of betraying one's principles, infighting among coalition members, or public figures abandoning the cause. Jonathan knew the endgame was near, but the question was whether the coalition could survive long enough to make a lasting impact. The crisis at the summit. The culmination of these tensions came at the annual political summit that the Unity Project had been planning for months. It was supposed to be the event that demonstrated the coalition's ability to bring diverse groups together under a common banner. Speakers from across the ideological spectrum had been invited, and the event was designed to showcase the coalition's power to change the conversation. But as the event approached, things began to fall apart. The logistics of the summit became a nightmare. Scheduling conflicts arose, with key members of the coalition threatening to withdraw unless their demands were met. The final straw came when a leading speaker, Dr. Elaine Perkins, a progressive icon, decided to pull out at the last minute. Her withdrawal sent shockwaves through the coalition, and others soon followed suit. "We can't do this without her," Jonathan said in a meeting with the remaining members. "Dr. Perkins is a cornerstone of the progressive faction. Her absence will send the wrong message." But Evelyn Lawson, who had remained a steadfast ally, was growing increasingly frustrated. "We're trying to please everyone, Jonathan. That's the problem. We've bent over backward to accommodate every faction, and all we've done is weaken the message. We need to focus on the people who believe in what we're doing, not the ones who are constantly moving the goalposts." Jonathan sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The Unity Project was slipping through his fingers. The summit was supposed to be a moment of triumph, but instead, it was turning into a fiasco. The internal divisions had festered, and now it seemed impossible to reconcile the varying interests. Public support waned as news of the summit's failure began to spread. So did disillusionment. The public, once intrigued by the promise of unity, started to lose interest. Supporters of the coalition began to abandon it, frustrated by the lack of tangible results and the constant bickering. Social media, once a platform for conversation, was now filled with scathing critiques. Each post, each comment, felt like another nail in the coffin of the Unity Project. Jonathan couldn't escape the criticism. Every time he checked his phone, there were new headlines calling him a failure. Even his own family, once his biggest supporters, began to express doubts. "I don't know what you're trying to achieve anymore, Jonathan," his mother said one evening, her voice tinged with worry. "This was supposed to be about bringing people together, but it's tearing everything apart." He felt the sting of her words. His mother, always his rock, was no longer confident in him. And the more he tried to reassure her, the more he realized that he was trying to convince himself too. The media had turned against him, and with it, the public trust that had once been so carefully cultivated. The critics who had dismissed him as a dreamer were now proclaiming their victory, and Jonathan was left questioning whether he had made a monumental mistake. A call from his father, just as Jonathan was beginning to lose faith. His father called him. The elder Richardson had been a constant presence throughout Jonathan's life, a pillar of strength, but also a man whose own political convictions often seemed worlds apart from his son's vision. Their relationship had been strained at times, especially when Jonathan had started the Unity Project, but now, his father's voice on the phone carried a sense of urgency. "You're at a crossroads, Jonathan," his father said. "You know that. I've been watching everything unfold, and I can tell you're struggling, but I want you to listen to me." Jonathan listened in silence, not knowing what to expect. "I know you want to change things. I know you want to fix this fractured country," his father continued. "But change isn't easy. You've been trying to play nice with everyone, and look where that's gotten you. You can't keep bending over backward for people who are never going to agree with you." Jonathan sat up straight, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I didn't get to where I am by making friends with everyone," his father said. "I made enemies, but I also got things done. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose some people if it means you can gain others who are genuinely aligned with your goals. You have to stop worrying about being liked and start worrying about getting things done." Jonathan could feel the clarity in his father's voice, a reminder of the pragmatism that had defined his father's career. He had always admired his father's ability to make tough decisions, even when they were unpopular. But it was hard for Jonathan to let go of the idealism that had driven the Unity Project in the first place. "I'm not saying you throw away everything you've worked for," his father added. "But sometimes you have to adjust your approach. You can't save everyone." Jonathan sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his father's advice settling over him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a clear sense of direction. The battle wasn't over, but he now understood what he needed to do next. At a turning point, Jonathan realized that the Unity Project was not going to succeed by trying to please everyone. He had to focus on the core principles that had originally driven him. The desire to foster meaningful conversation, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity. The next few days were filled with a flurry of activity. Jonathan called a meeting with the remaining coalition members, telling them that things had to change. It was no longer about appeasing every faction. It was about finding a more focused vision and being unflinching in the pursuit of it. "We've been too concerned with optics, too concerned with what people think about us," Jonathan told the group. "We need to stop trying to make everyone happy and start working with those who truly believe in what we're doing. We can't afford to keep losing ground. It's time to be unapologetically committed to this mission." As he spoke, Jonathan could see the group's energy shift. The leaders of the coalition were listening. They could feel the change in Jonathan's tone. This wasn't the same uncertain man who had been trying to walk a tightrope for the last few months. This was someone who had made peace with the fact that the road ahead would be difficult, and who was ready to face it head on. But as Jonathan prepared to push forward, he knew that the hardest battles were still to come. The public had turned against him, and the coalition's credibility was on the line. But for the first time in a long while, Jonathan felt ready to fight for it. The months that followed marked a dramatic shift for Jonathan and the Unity Project. With a new sense of resolve, Jonathan and the remaining members of the coalition pushed forward with a refined strategy. They became less focused on appeasing every faction and more determined to engage with the people who shared their core values. While this meant that they lost some allies along the way, it also meant they began to attract a new, more committed group of supporters. Rebuilding trust. The initial years of the Unity Project had been filled with hope and optimism, but those ideals had been clouded by the harsh realities of politics. Now, Jonathan understood that true unity wasn't about trying to be everything to everyone. It was about finding common ground with people who were willing to work together for shared goals, no matter how difficult the journey. The first step in rebuilding trust came from addressing the critics. Jonathan didn't shy away from the media or the public. Instead, he leaned into the criticism. He began speaking openly about the challenges the coalition had faced, acknowledging the missteps and explaining the lessons learned. "I know we've made mistakes," Jonathan said in a public address, "but we are learning from them. We're growing stronger, and we're more committed than ever to finding common ground, even when it's hard." This raw honesty resonated with many people. It wasn't the polished, idealized vision of unity that the media had once expected. Instead, it was a realistic, human approach to the complexity of politics. Jonathan and the coalition embraced their flaws, and that vulnerability allowed them to rebuild credibility and trust. A renewed vision, the core of the Unity Project, a project that had once seemed doomed by its compromises, began to take shape in a more focused and achievable way. The coalition shifted its focus to tangible, actionable goals. Instead of trying to change everything at once, they focused on specific issues where collaboration across political lines was possible. They worked on reforming education, bridging the urban-rural divide, and addressing economic inequality. For Jonathan, the Unity Project became a model of compromise, not for the sake of pleasing everyone, but for creating real, lasting change in a world that often seemed too divided to heal. It was no longer about proving that unity could be achieved at all costs. Instead, it was about demonstrating that even the most fractured political landscape could yield results if people were willing to put their differences aside and focus on the bigger picture. But it wasn't just about policies. It was about people. Jonathan's personal journey had been one of self-discovery. As he learned to navigate the murky waters of political compromise, deal with disappointment, and still hold on to his core beliefs, he realized that leadership wasn't about being perfect or never making mistakes. It was about having the courage to stay true to one's values and learn from every misstep along the way. The legacy of the Unity Project. Years after the summit fiasco, the Unity Project had evolved into a force that was not only respected, but also influential in shaping key policy discussions. While it wasn't the sweeping success that Jonathan had once imagined, it was a testament to the idea that genuine change requires patience, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to the long-term vision. Jonathan's name became synonymous with the idea of principled compromise, where unity wasn't about erasing differences, but acknowledging them while still working toward common goals. He had learned the hard way that unity wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process of building trust, fostering dialogue, and finding common ground in the face of division. A moment of reflection on a quiet evening, Jonathan stood at the window of his office, looking out over the city. The political landscape had shifted in ways that would have been unimaginable a few years earlier. He thought back to the moment when everything had felt like it was falling apart. The day he'd been kicked out of the summit, the day he'd been publicly humiliated. It had been a turning point, one that forced him to reevaluate his strategy, his goals, and his purpose. "I've come a long way," Jonathan murmured to himself, his reflection in the glass, a reminder of how far he'd come. He had weathered the storms, faced the criticism, and learned from every setback. But as he reflected on everything that had led him here, he knew that the true test of his work was still ahead. The Unity Project had gained some ground, but the world was still divided in ways that would take more than just one man, or even one movement, to change. The battle for unity, he understood now, was a lifelong endeavor. It was an ongoing journey of challenges and growth, but one that could make a difference if enough people were willing to join it. As the sun set on the horizon, Jonathan felt a sense of peace. He had learned to accept that not everyone would agree with him, and not every plan would succeed. But he also knew that change was possible, and it was worth fighting for. And so, with a renewed sense of purpose, Jonathan stepped away from the window and prepared for the next chapter in the story of the Unity Project. The journey wasn't over, but it had begun to take shape in ways that were more meaningful than he had ever imagined.